Hello there, and welcome to the Sleep with Science channel. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps the channel to reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. Somewhere out there, beyond the last pale light of our sun, something small and silver is falling through the dark. It is not falling toward anything. It is falling away from everything. Away from the warmth of Earth, away from the blue marble where every person you have ever loved has drawn breath, away from the sound of rain, the smell of soil, the comfort of gravity holding you gently to the ground. It has been falling for longer than most human lives last, and it will keep falling long after every one of us is gone. Tonight, we are going to follow it. Quietly, slowly. Let your body soften into whatever is holding you right now, because where we are going, there is no hurry. There has never been any hurry out there. Time moves differently in the space between stars, and so tonight, so will we. What would it feel like to be the most distant handmade object in existence? To carry, sealed inside a golden record, the sound of human laughter, a mother's heartbeat, a whale's low song, and know that no one may ever hear it again? What would it feel like to outlive the mission that built you, to outlive the scientists who dreamed you into being, to become, slowly, achingly, the loneliest object ever created? There is a spacecraft carrying that exact silence right now, moving through a darkness so complete that sunlight itself takes over 20 hours just to reach it. Let that settle into you. 20 hours. If you shouted into the void at the speed of light, your voice would still be traveling, still be reaching, for the better part of a day, before it ever brushed against that tiny, wandering machine. And still, it moves on, alone, faithful, listening. This is the story of Voyager, humanity's furthest reaching hand, stretched out into the black on a September morning in 1977, when the world was so very different, and yet the stars above it were exactly the same stars you might glimpse tonight if you looked up. Let your eyes stay closed. You do not need to see them to feel them. Picture, if you will, a small world of gold-plated aluminum and delicate antennae, no larger than a compact car, drifting through vacuum with a grace that no human vessel could ever replicate. There is no air to slow it. There is no friction to wear it down. There is only the patient pull of gravity and the endless coasting of momentum, carrying it onward at more than 38,000 miles an hour, faster than any bullet, faster than any thought you have ever had, and yet, against the staggering scale of space, it seems to barely move at all. It began its life close to home, in the comforting geometry of our solar system, gliding past Jupiter's storms the color of dried blood and old amber, past Saturn's rings, thin as breath, thin as the space between waking and sleep. It paused, in its own quiet way, to look at worlds no human eye had ever studied so closely, moons wrapped in ice, atmospheres thick with orange haze, storms larger than our entire planet swirling in patient, endless circles. And then, having seen what it came to see, it did not stop. It did not rest. It simply kept going, because that was its nature, to keep reaching outward, past the last planet, past the icy debris at the solar system's edge, into a boundary few had ever thought to name. There is a place, far beyond where Pluto wanders in its long, cold orbit, where the sun's influence begins to fade like a whispered lullaby fading into silence. The solar wind, that endless breath of charged particles streaming outward from our star, begins to lose its strength there, pushed back by something vast and quiet, the whispering pressure of interstellar space itself. It is a boundary without a fence, without a marker, without a single visible sign, and yet it is real, and it is waiting, and Voyager was moving toward it with the patient certainty of something that does not know how to stop, does not know how to turn back, does not know, perhaps, that what lies ahead will be unlike anything it has ever touched before, a darkness so profound, so complete that even starlight seems to grow thin and uncertain, stretched across distances the mind cannot quite hold. Let yourself rest here in this thought for a moment. There is no need to understand it fully. There is only the gentle drifting of attention, the way a leaf might drift on still water, touching the edges of something vast without needing to grasp its shape. This boundary Voyager approached has a name, though the name matters less than the feeling of it. Scientists call it the heliopause, the place where the sun's breath finally gives way to the older, colder breath of the galaxy itself. Imagine our sun, that great and generous fire, exhaling outward in every direction, a constant stream of particles racing away from it in a bubble so large that light itself takes many hours to cross from one side to the other. This bubble is called the heliosphere, and everything you have ever known, every sunrise, every summer afternoon, every star you have wished upon, has occurred safely inside its boundary. And Voyager, small and steady, was moving toward its very edge, toward the last whisper of home. There is something deeply moving about a journey with no return. Voyager was never meant to come back. It carries no parachute, no reverse engine, no plan for retrieval. Its mission was always outward, always forward, a one-way arrow fired into the dark with only the faintest hope that somewhere, sometime, someone or something might notice its passing. And yet it does not travel in despair. It travels the way a river travels to the sea, without hesitation, without doubt, simply moving because moving is what it was always going to do. As it drifted further from the sun, the light around it grew fainter and fainter, until the great blazing star that once warmed Earth's oceans and grew Earth's forests became little more than a bright point among countless other points, indistinguishable, at a glance, from any other star in the sky. Imagine that. Imagine looking back one day and no longer being able to tell which tiny light was the one that gave you life. This is what awaited Voyager, a slow and gentle forgetting, not of memory, but of distinction, as the sun itself began to blend into the vast tapestry of distant fires. And still, it carried its cargo. On board, sealed against the vacuum, rests a golden record, hand-assembled by scientists and dreamers who wished to leave something of humanity behind, something true, something tender. Greetings recorded in dozens of languages. Images of children playing, of mountains rising, of DNA spiraling in its endless quiet dance. Music, too, drifting silently through the void, box compositions folded beside the songs of another culture entirely, all of it waiting, patiently, for ears that may never come, for minds that may never exist, for a moment of contact that may never occur. And yet it was placed there anyway, because hope does not require certainty. Hope only requires the act of reaching. Let your breathing slow now, matching the unhurried pace of this journey. There is no reason to rush toward any conclusion tonight. Out here, in the space between the last planets and the true interstellar dark, time loses its familiar shape. A year is nothing. A decade passes like a single held breath. Voyager moved through this stretched and patient time, sending back signals so faint that by the time they reached Earth, they carried barely a whisper of power, less energy, in fact, than it takes to light a single small bulb for a fraction of a second. And yet within that whisper lived entire worlds of data, temperature readings, magnetic field measurements, tiny fragments of understanding pulled from a place no human had ever touched. Consider the antenna itself, a wide, dish-shaped structure pointed with mathematical precision back toward a planet it could no longer see with any instrument on board. It aimed not by sight, but by memory, by calculation, by the quiet trust that Earth would still be there, still listening, still receiving whatever thin signal managed to cross the widening gulf between them. This is a kind of faith, is it not? A machine reaching backward across billions of miles, trusting that someone remains on the other end. As the years passed, one by one, the storms of Jupiter and the rings of Saturn grew distant in Voyager's wake, replaced by an emptiness so profound it becomes difficult to describe using ordinary words. Emptiness here does not mean silence, though silence is certainly part of it. It means space itself becomes sparse, stretched thin, the average distance between anything and anything else growing so vast that entire human lifetimes could pass before another meaningful encounter might occur. Voyager began to enter this region slowly, the way a swimmer might drift from the shallow, sunlit shore of a lake into its darker, colder, more uncertain depths, unaware of exactly when the transition happened, only certain, in hindsight, that it had. And somewhere in that slow transition, without any single dramatic moment to mark it, the instruments aboard Voyager began to notice a change so subtle that only patient, careful listening could detect it at all. The density of particles around the spacecraft began to shift. The magnetic field, once shaped by the sun's own breath, began to bend in a different direction, as though some new, older current had begun to take hold. Let this thought settle over you gently, the way a blanket settles over tired shoulders. Even in the deepest dark, even in the most distant reaches, there is still something to notice, still some faint pattern for a curious instrument or a curious mind to trace. It is worth pausing here, in this unhurried stretch of night, to consider just how far Voyager had already come by this point in its journey. Having launched from Earth in 1977, it did not reach this uncertain threshold for several decades. Imagine that patience. Imagine a single unbroken task, stretching across 30 years, 40 years, without pause, without vacation, without rest. Most human endeavors are measured in months or years. Voyager's endeavor is measured in the slow turning of an entire era, a span of time long enough for children to become grandparents, for entire technologies to rise, flourish, and fade away, all while one small, gold-plated traveler continued its quiet, singular task of moving forward. There is something profoundly soothing about this kind of persistence, is there not? Not the frantic persistence of urgency, but the deep, unbroken persistence of simply continuing, breath after breath, moment after moment, without needing to know exactly when the goal will be reached. Let your own breathing settle into this same rhythm now. Slow and unhurried, the way Voyager itself glided through the dark, never rushing, never faltering, simply moving forward because moving forward was its nature. As it drifted deeper into this transitional region, place scientists would later name the heliosheath, the solar wind that once pushed outward with such steady force began to slow and turn turbulent, like a calm river suddenly meeting the resistance of an incoming tide. Here, the charged particles streaming from our sun no longer moved swiftly outward in one direction. Instead, they became compressed, chaotic, swirling against an unseen pressure from the interstellar medium beyond. Voyager's instruments, sensitive beyond anything we might imagine holding in our own hands, measured this turbulence quietly, faithfully, sending home data that painted a picture of a boundary far stranger and far more complex than anyone had first imagined. Picture, if you can, an invisible shoreline, not made of sand or stone, but of pressure and particles, where two great winds meet, one blowing outward from our sun, the other drifting inward from the ancient light of countless other stars. This meeting place is not still. It churns and ripples, invisible waves crashing against invisible currents, a storm with no thunder, no lightning, no sound at all, only the silent language of magnetic fields and charged particles, spoken in a frequency human senses were never built to perceive directly. And yet, we perceive it now, together, in this quiet moment, through the patient translations of instruments and scientists who spent their careers listening to whispers few others thought to notice. Let that be a comfort to you tonight. Even the most hidden, most distant phenomena in the universe are not entirely beyond our reach. They simply require patience, attentiveness, and the willingness to listen closely to very faint and very old signals. As Voyager continued its slow crossing of this turbulent shoreline, its distance from Earth continued to grow, mile by mile, until the very idea of measuring that distance in miles began to feel almost meaningless. Scientists shifted instead to measuring its distance in light. In the sheer number of hours it took a radio signal, traveling at the fastest speed the universe allows, to stretch from Voyager's antenna back to the giant listening dishes scattered across our planet. What began as minutes at launch slowly became hours, and those hours continued to grow, longer and longer, with each passing year, until conversations between Voyager and its distant home became less like conversations and more like slow, patient letters, sent and received across a gulf so vast that immediacy itself lost all meaning. Let yourself imagine for a moment what it might feel like to send a single message and know, calmly, without anxiety, that its reply would not arrive again for many long hours. There is a kind of peace in that kind of distance, a release from the urgency that so often fills our own daily lives. Out here, in the quiet dark that Voyager was slowly entering, urgency simply does not exist. There is only the patient unfolding of time, one silent moment stretching gently into the next, undisturbed by hurry, untouched by the small anxieties that so often crowd our waking hours back here on Earth. Let those anxieties go now, just for a little while. You do not need them tonight. Out there, in the turbulent hush of the heliosheath, there is only the slow work of crossing, and the quiet trust that crossing is enough. By now, Voyager had been traveling for so long that the very engineers who built it had, many of them, grown old, retired, or passed their work along to a new generation who had not yet been born when the spacecraft first left Earth. Think of that gently, without sadness, only wonder. A single mission, spanning so many human lifetimes that entire careers began and ended in its shadow, while the small craft itself continued on, unaware of the passage of human years, untouched by birthdays or retirements or the quiet turning over of generations back on the world it had left behind. It simply moved, faithfully, through the dark, carrying its golden record and its fading power source, deeper into a region of space where the sun's authority grew thinner with every passing mile. Inside Voyager, a small nuclear generator hummed on, quietly converting the slow decay of radioactive material into the electricity needed to keep its instruments alive. This is a strange and beautiful kind of fire, is it not? Not the bright, consuming fire of flame, but a patient, invisible fire, one that burns for decades without ever being seen, without ever needing air, without ever flickering in wind, because there is no wind here to flicker in. This quiet, decaying warmth was Voyager's only companion, its only source of continued life, ticking away, slowly, faithfully, granting just enough power to keep a handful of instruments breathing, even as others, one by one, were gently switched off to conserve what little strength remained. Imagine having to choose, over the years, which parts of yourself to let rest so that other parts might continue. Voyager's controllers, back on Earth, made these choices with great care, turning off cameras that could no longer see anything meaningful in encompassing dark, powering down instruments no longer essential to its long, outward journey, preserving only what was needed to keep listening, keep measuring, keep reaching back with its thin, faint signal. There is something tender in this kind of care, a kind of parental patience, ensuring that what mattered most could continue for as long as possible, even as the whole must slowly, gradually, let go of what it no longer needed. And so Voyager pressed onward, lighter now in function though heavier in the significance of all it carried, moving through the churning boundary where solar wind met interstellar whisper. The turbulence here was unlike anything a human traveler could ever directly feel. No wind against skin, no roar against ears, only shifting magnetic fields and charged particles rearranging themselves in slow, invisible currents. Yet instruments captured it all, translating that unseen storm into gentle streams of data, careful measurements sent home across the widening dark, arriving on Earth as soft radio whispers, decoded patiently by scientists who had waited years, sometimes decades, simply to understand what lay in this uncertain, shifting shoreline between our solar system and the vast ocean of stars beyond. Let your thoughts drift now to the sheer scale of the emptiness Voyager was moving through. In the space between stars, matter becomes so sparse that a single cubic centimeter, smaller than the tip of your smallest finger, might contain, on average, less than a single atom. Compare that to the air surrounding you right now, filled with billions upon billions of atoms in that same tiny space, and you begin to sense just how profoundly empty Voyager's path had become. This is not emptiness in the way a quiet room feels empty. This is emptiness on a scale the human mind was never quite built to hold, a thinness of matter so extreme that light itself can travel for years without striking a single obstacle. And yet, within this vast thinness, Voyager continued, small and steady, carrying its whisper of home through a darkness few could ever fully imagine. It did not know loneliness the way a person might know it, curled beneath blankets on a quiet night, missing a voice or a touch long since gone. Its loneliness was different, quieter, a simple fact of distance rather than an ache of absence. And yet, in another sense, perhaps it was lonelier still, for it carried within its golden record the sound of laughter, the whisper of lullabies, the warmth of human connection, sealed forever behind cold metal, drifting further and further from anyone who might ever hear it, ever again, unless some distant intelligence, some patient listener among the stars, should ever come close enough to lift the needle, to trace the grooves cut into copper and gold, and let the sounds of earth pour outward into whatever strange ears or instruments might receive them. Think, for a moment, of the improbability folded into that hope. The record was never meant for certainty. It was meant for possibility, however small, however distant, however many tens of thousands of years might pass before it drifted near anything at all. The nearest star system, Proxima Centauri, lies so far away that even at the speed Voyager travels, tens of thousands of years would pass before it came anywhere close, and even then, close is a relative word, meaning perhaps light years still, a distance so vast it renders the word close almost meaningless. Voyager is not headed toward any star in particular. It was never aimed at a destination in that sense. It was aimed at momentum, at escape, at the simple act of leaving, and let the story of contact remain what it always was, a whisper cast into the dark, not expecting an answer, but unwilling to stay silent all the same. Consider what it means to send a message with no address. On Earth, a letter always finds a recipient, a place, a name, a mailbox waiting at the end of the journey. But this message, this golden circle of sound and image, was written to no one. It was written to the possibility of someone. It was an act of faith performed by scientists who understood, better than most, how staggeringly small that possibility might be. And yet they built it anyway, chose the songs anyway, etched the diagrams anyway, because the alternative, saying nothing, offering nothing, felt like a kind of surrender they were unwilling to accept. There is something deeply human in that refusal to stay quiet, even when the silence might be safer, even when the odds suggest that no one is listening. And so Voyager carries forward, not as a machine merely completing its function, but as a kind of vessel for a species longing to be known. It is strange to think that of all the things Voyager transmits, it is not the golden record that people wait to hear from. The record remains sealed, untouched, drifting in physical silence, while the instruments still send their steady chatter of magnetic field data and particle counts back to Earth. The message that took the longest to make, the message wrapped in gold and etched with symbols meant to survive a billion years, has instead become the quietest part of the spacecraft's voice. It speaks only through its potential. Everything else it carries speaks through their diligence. Somewhere in the passing years, Voyager's plutonium heart, the radioisotope thermoelectric generator glowing faintly with the slow decay of its fuel, has continued weakening. Each year, its output diminishes, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the same patient inevitability as everything else about this journey. Engineers on Earth, watching from control rooms filled with screens and quiet hums, have had to make careful choices about which instruments to power down first, which whispers of the craft's senses to let fall silent so that others might continue speaking a little longer. It's a strange kind of triage, deciding which parts of a distant, aging machine deserve to keep functioning, and which must go quiet so the whole can survive a little further into the dark. You might imagine, if only briefly, what it would feel like to be present in one of those rooms, watching numbers slowly decline on a screen, understanding that each decision brings the spacecraft closer to the day its voice will fade entirely. There is a certain grief embedded in that kind of science, a tenderness rarely spoken aloud but deeply felt by those who spend their careers listening to a machine's distant signal, faint as a heartbeat heard through many layers of blankets. And yet, there's also pride, quiet and steady. In every extra year Voyager continues speaking, every unexpected extension of its life beyond what its creators believed possible so many decades ago. Because Voyager was never expected to survive this long, was never expected to still be transmitting from beyond the heliosphere, still whispering its data across billions of miles, still carrying that golden record further into a night with no end in sight. It has become something more than a spacecraft. It has become an ongoing question, hanging silently in the void, asking whether distance and time can ever truly separate connection from meaning, whether a message can still hold significance even if it never finds an audience, whether the act of reaching outward, even into presumed emptiness, is itself a kind of answer to loneliness rather than a surrender to it. The star's Voyager now drifts among do not care about these questions. They burn and fade with a rhythm untouched by human hopes, indifferent in the vast and patient way that only stars can be. And still, Voyager continues onward, carrying its cargo of memory and sound into a place where indifference is the only response it has ever truly received. But indifference, we should remember, is not the same as silence, and silence, when carried far enough, can still contain within it the shape of something waiting to be heard, if only the right listener, however impossible, however distant, ever comes close enough to notice. Let your mind settle now on the instruments themselves, those quiet sensors still drawing their thin trickle of power from a heart that has been dying, slowly, gracefully, for nearly 5 decades. Each one measures something different, something invisible to human eyes. The magnetometer senses the faint tug and twist of magnetic fields that no hand could ever feel, fields stretched thin across the space between stars, remnants of ancient stellar winds and the slow churn of the galaxy itself. The plasma wave instrument listens, in its own way, to the trembling of charged particles, translating their motion into something almost like sound, a low and alien hum that scientists on Earth have learned to interpret as the breathing of interstellar space. It is not sound as we know it, not vibrations moving through air, for there is no air here to carry them. It is something stranger, a pattern of oscillations in plasma, converted by human ingenuity into tones the ear can recognize, a kind of translation between two languages, one spoken by the universe, one spoken by us. When scientists first heard this translated hum, back when Voyager 1 crossed into interstellar space in the year 2012, though the confirmation came later, in 2013, after careful analysis, there was something almost sacred in that moment. A machine built by human hands had found a way to let people hear the space between stars, however imperfectly, however filtered through instruments and algorithms and human interpretation. It was not a voice. It was not a greeting. It was simply the universe being itself, indifferent and vast, and yet, for a brief moment, comprehensible. Consider how strange it is that we, small and fleeting, bound to a single fragile planet, found a way to listen to the space between the stars before we ever found a way to visit it ourselves. Voyager did what no human body ever could ever survive doing. It passed beyond the reach of our sun's protective bubble, beyond the heliopause, that invisible boundary where the solar wind, the constant outward breath of charged particles from our star, finally grows too weak to hold back the pressure of interstellar space. Beyond that boundary lies a different kind of medium, colder, thinner, filled with particles that did not come from our sun but drifted here from the deaths and lives of other stars entirely, some of them older than our sun itself, older than Earth, older, perhaps, than the very idea of life. Think of that for a moment, quietly, as your thoughts continue to slow. Voyager now moves through matter that predates our solar system. It travels among the ashes of stars that burned and died long before our own star ever gathered itself together, condensing out of a swirling cloud of gas and dust into the sun that later gave us light and warmth and eventually life. In some sense, Voyager has entered a kind of memory made physical, a residue of cosmic history embedded in the sparse atoms it now moves through, atoms with stories written in nuclear fire far older than our own beginnings. And still, despite this vast and ancient backdrop, Voyager remains, unmistakably, a product of human hands. Its solid frame, its circuitry, its instruments, all built by engineers who worked with slide rules and early computers, technology that today seems almost impossibly primitive when compared to devices carried in human pockets. And yet, this ordinary technology, extraordinary in its persistence rather than its complexity, has succeeded in doing what no other human creation had done before, crossing into a space beyond the sun's influence entirely, entering the realm between stars. It's worth pausing here, letting the scale of that achievement settle, without rushing forward too quickly. There is no need to hurry through wonder. Sometimes the most profound truths deserve to be held gently, turned over slowly in the mind, much like a stone smoothed by years of water, revealing its shape only through patience. Voyager's crossing into interstellar space was not marked by fireworks or sudden clarity. It was confirmed slowly, through careful analysis of data, through months of scientists comparing measurements, checking assumptions, waiting for certainty before making an announcement. There was no dramatic moment of crossing a visible line. There was only data, quiet and patient, revealing a truth that had already occurred, unnoticed, days or weeks earlier. This slowness, this delayed understanding, feels fitting somehow, given everything else about Voyager's journey. Its entire existence has been defined by patience, by the long, unhurried passage of time, by distances too vast to comprehend all at once. Even its moment of leaving home was not sudden. It was a slow unfolding, an almost imperceptible transition from one kind of space to another, much like falling asleep, where the exact moment of departure from wakefulness can never quite be pinpointed, only recognized afterward, quietly, gently, as something that has already happened, long before the mind caught up to the change. Let yourself rest in that idea for a moment, the notion that the most significant transitions in life, and perhaps in the life of a spacecraft as well, rarely announce themselves with clarity. They arrive quietly, almost apologetically, revealing their full weight only in hindsight. Voyager's passage into interstellar space was like this, a threshold crossed in silence, recognized only through the patient accumulation of evidence, through data points gathered across weeks, plotted and compared, until scientists could finally say, with confidence, that the spacecraft had truly left the solar wind behind. And what a strange kind of leaving it was. Not a leaving of place, exactly, for space itself has no walls, no doors to pass through, no threshold marked by anything visible to the eye. It was a leaving of influence, a slow release from the invisible grip of our sun's breath, that outward rush of solar wind that had, until that point, surrounded Voyager for its entire journey, whispering against its instruments in a language of charged particles. To leave that influence behind was to enter a kind of silence deeper than any Voyager had known before, a silence not of sound, for space has never carried sound in the way we imagine it, but a silence of belonging, a departure from the last thread connecting it to home. Picture, if you can, the moment scientists confirmed this crossing, sitting in rooms lit by the soft glow of monitors, surrounded by the quiet hum of servers processing signals that had taken over 17 hours to arrive from so many billions of miles away. There was no urgency in this discovery, no need for haste, only a careful, methodical unfolding of understanding, much like solving a puzzle whose pieces arrive one at a time, each one requiring patience before its place becomes clear. This is how so much of space exploration unfolds, not in moments of dramatic revelation, but in slow, careful accumulation, truth built one measurement at a time. Consider, too, the plutonium at Voyager's core, the radioactive fuel slowly decaying within its generator, releasing heat that engineers converted into the electricity powering every instrument, every whisper of data sent home. This fuel does not burn in the way we imagine fire burning, quick and consuming. It decays instead, slowly, predictably, according to the quiet mathematics of half-lives, a term that itself carries a strange poetry, half of something disappearing, then half of what remains, and half again, an eternal approach toward zero that never quite arrives, at least not within any span of time we could easily comprehend. This slow decay mirrors, in some ways, the slow fading of Voyager's own capabilities. Instruments once bright with function have been dimmed, deliberately, by careful hands on Earth, prioritizing warmth for systems most essential to survival over those less critical to the mission's continuation. It is a strange kind of caretaking, performed across billions of miles, guided by patience and calculation rather than touch. Engineers speak to Voyager now, and their words take over a day to arrive, whispered instructions crossing the emptiness at the speed of light, only to be answered by another day of waiting before any response makes its way back. Conversations, if you could call them that, unfold across nearly 2 days for a single exchange, a rhythm so slow it resembles less a conversation and more a series of letters exchanged between distant lovers separated by unimaginable distance, patient in their devotion, unhurried in their affection. There is something quietly moving in imagining these exchanges, these careful, deliberate messages sent outward with no certainty of immediate reply, met eventually by faint signals returning from the edge of known space, carrying information about temperature, radiation, magnetic fields, small fragments of understanding pulled from the vast unknown and brought gently back into human hands. Each exchange represents an act of extraordinary patience, a willingness to wait, to trust that distance does not mean disconnection, only delay. Perhaps this, too, mirrors something deeply human, the way we sometimes wait for answers we cannot rush, sending our hopes outward into uncertainty, trusting that somewhere, eventually, a response might return, even if it takes far longer than we would wish. Voyager's story, in this sense, becomes not just a story of scientific achievement, but a meditation on patience itself, on distance, on the quiet faith required to continue reaching outward without guarantee of reply. As the years pass, as more instruments grow silent, as the plutonium continues its slow, invisible decay, Voyager will eventually reach a point where its voice fades entirely, where no more whispers of data will cross that greatest of distances back to Earth. This moment, too, will likely arrive quietly, without fanfare, recognized perhaps only in retrospect, when engineers realize that the last signal received was, in fact, the final one, that after months or years of no more efforts to re-establish contact, the truth becomes undeniable that Voyager has, at last, gone fully silent. Sit with that thought for a while, gently, without rushing toward its sadness or its strange comfort. Somewhere in the coming years, likely sometime in the decade ahead, the last instrument aboard Voyager will draw its final measure of power, and the spacecraft will continue on, unpowered, unspeaking, yet still moving, still carrying its golden record outward into the dark. It will not stop. It will not fall. There is no friction in interstellar space to slow it, no resistance to wear it down. It will simply continue, forever now a silent traveler, its voice extinguished, but its journey unbroken. This is perhaps one of the strangest truths about Voyager's eventual silence. It will not mark the end of its motion, only the end of its communication. The spacecraft will still drift onward, carried by the same momentum given to it by a rocket launched from Earth so many decades earlier, momentum that space itself will never take away. Long after the last human alive today has passed, long after the memory of Voyager's launch has faded from living recollection, the spacecraft will still be moving, silent and dark, through the space between the stars, carrying its golden record like a sealed letter with no one left to check the address. There is something almost unbearably tender in this image, a machine continuing to move long after it has stopped speaking, still faithful to its trajectory, still carrying its cargo of human memory, even though no one on Earth will ever hear from it again. It becomes, in this way, less like a machine and more like an idea set loose into the universe, unattached now to its makers, existing purely as motion and memory, drifting onward without need of confirmation, without need of acknowledgement, simply continuing because continuing is what it was always meant to do. Consider how different this is from most human endeavors, which so often require witnesses, require some kind of recognition to feel complete. Voyager, once silent, will receive no more attention from Earth, no further study, no additional signals sent to inquire about its condition. It will exist, from that point onward, entirely alone in a way it had never quite been before, even during all those years of interstellar drifting. Until now, however faint, however delayed, there had always been a kind of relationship between Voyager and Earth, question and answer stretched across days, but a relationship nonetheless. Once its power fades entirely, that relationship, too, will end, leaving only motion, only trajectory, only the golden record and the quiet spacecraft carrying it onward through the dark. And yet, we might ask ourselves, is a message truly meaningless once its sender can no longer confirm its delivery? Is meaning contingent on acknowledgement, or does it exist independently, waiting patiently for the right conditions, the right listener, the right moment across some future span of time we cannot yet imagine? These are questions without clear answers, existing somewhere between science and philosophy, between the careful data of astrophysics and the older, quieter questions humans have asked themselves since the very first fires were lit beneath ancient skies, staring upward, wondering if anything out there might be staring back. Voyager, in its eventual silence, becomes a kind of physical embodiment of that question, sent outward not with certainty, but with hope, a hope built into golden grooves and etched diagrams, waiting for a future so distant that no human civilization as we know it might exist to witness whatever answer, if any, eventually arrives. It is a strange kind of patience, one that stretches beyond any single human lifetime, beyond generations, beyond perhaps even the lifespan of our species itself, entrusting its message instead to the almost unimaginable patience of the universe. Think, too, of how the Earth itself will change in the time it takes for Voyager to drift toward even the faintest possibility of encounter. Continents may shift, however slowly, our sun will continue its own quiet aging, and even our species, whatever we might become across so vast a stretch of time, may look entirely different from what exists today, if humanity exists at all in any recognizable form by then. Voyager, silent, drifting, indifferent to the passage of these changes, will continue regardless, unaware of what unfolds on the small blue world it once called home, faithful only to the physics that first set it in motion, faithful only to momentum, gravity's whispered permission granted so long ago during a single, carefully calculated gravitational assist past Jupiter and Saturn, worlds it once passed with instruments awake and eager, drinking in every photon of light and data those giant planets had to offer, before turning its gaze outward, toward the silence that always waited beyond the reach of any instrument, beyond even the patient stretch of imagination itself. There is something profoundly quiet about the way Voyager crossed the threshold of the heliopause, that vast and invisible boundary where the sun's influence finally surrenders to the deeper currents of interstellar space. It did not happen with drama. There was no burst of light, no sound, for sound requires a medium to travel and the void offers none. Instead, it happened as a whisper of changing particles, a shift detected only through the delicate instruments still functioning after decades of travel, plasma wave sensors picking up the subtle hum of a different kind of space, one no longer touched by the solar wind that had cradled Voyager since the moment of its launch. In August of 2012, Voyager 1 slipped across this boundary, and in November of 2018, Voyager 2 followed, each spacecraft carrying its own quiet crossing into a realm human instruments had never directly sampled before. It is worth pausing here, in this stillness, to consider what that threshold truly represents. Not a wall, not a line drawn with any finality, but a gradual transition, a place where the sun's breath grows faint enough that the whispers of other stars, other winds, begin to make themselves known. Beyond this boundary lies the interstellar medium, a region so sparse that the human mind struggles to hold its emptiness in any meaningful way. Here, atoms drift at a density lower than nearly anything replicable on Earth, a near-perfect vacuum interrupted only occasionally by clouds of hydrogen and helium, remnants of long-dead stars, dust from supernovae that exploded before our solar system ever coalesced into being. Voyager moves through this now, a solitary traveler in an ocean that has no shores, no currents in the way we understand them, only the faint gravitational tides of the galaxy itself, patient and slow, indifferent to the small aluminum vessel passing through. And yet Voyager still speaks, for now. Its radioisotope thermoelectric generators, fueled by the slow decay of plutonium-238, continue to provide the trickle of power needed to keep a handful of instruments alive, though engineers on Earth have had to make difficult choices, turning off one instrument after another, letting parts of Voyager fall silent so that other parts might continue a little longer. The heaters that once kept sensitive components warm enough to function have been switched off in sequence, a slow and deliberate surrender to entropy, and still, remarkably, the spacecraft persists, transmitting data across a gulf of distance so vast that its signals, traveling at the speed of light, take over 22 hours to reach the giant dishes of the deep space network scattered across California, Spain, and Australia. Imagine that duration for a moment, not as an abstract number but as a lived reality. A message leaves Voyager, and by the time it arrives, nearly a full day has passed on Earth, an entire rotation of our planet complete before the whisper is heard. There is a peculiar intimacy in this delay, this vast gap between the moment of transmission and the moment of reception. It means that, in some sense, we never actually know what Voyager is doing right now, only what it was doing more than a full day ago, its present moment forever hidden behind the curtain of light's finite speed. Every image, every measurement, every faint pulse of information is already history by the time it reaches us, a message from the past, delivered by a machine that continues to exist somewhere far beyond that message, already further still, already deeper into the dark. Engineers estimate that Voyager's power will likely fade below the threshold needed to operate any instruments by the early 2030s, a slow dimming rather than a sudden extinguishing, one system after another falling quiet, until only the carrier signal remains, a bare whisper of electromagnetic presence with no data riding upon it, a heartbeat without words. And even after that, when no more signals return to Earth at all, when the last thread connecting us to this small drifting emissary finally goes silent, Voyager itself will not stop. It will not fall. It will not slow in any dramatic sense. It will simply continue, propelled by the same momentum granted decades ago, drifting through the interstellar medium at over 38,000 miles per hour, silent testimony to a species that once looked up and decided to reach outward. Consider what it will pass in that endless drifting. Not stars in any close sense, for the distances between stars are staggering, almost incomprehensible, such that Voyager's closest approach to another star system will not happen for tens of thousands of years, and even then, it will not visit so much as pass at a distance that would still seem vast beyond imagination, a ship crossing an ocean so wide that even its nearest port of call remains impossibly far away. Around the year 40,272, if such distant reckoning of time even holds meaning, Voyager 1 will drift within roughly 1.6 light-years of a star known as Gliese 445, a red dwarf in the constellation Camelopardalis, though within here means a distance still greater than the entire span between our Sun and its nearest stellar neighbor today, a reminder of just how empty, how vast, how solitary this journey truly is, and will continue to be, long after the voices that once sent it have long since faded into whatever future awaits our species, whatever form we might take, whatever memory, if any, might remain of the small blue world Voyager once called home. There is a strange comfort in imagining Voyager's path stretched out across such time, a comfort that comes not from certainty but from scale, from the way individual worry dissolves when measured against tens of thousands of years. We build our lives around days, around seasons, around the modest arithmetic of decades, And yet here is a machine whose story unfolds across timescales that render entire civilizations as brief flickers, entire languages born and forgotten before it travels even a fraction of the distance to that distant red dwarf. Gliese 445 will not know it is being approached. No sensor, no eye, no mind will greet Voyager's passage. The star will simply continue burning in its slow hydrogen-fusing rhythm, indifferent, ancient, patient in the way only stars can be patient, unaware that a fragment of a long-vanished species is drifting through the dark nearby, carrying with it sounds of rain, whale song, laughter, greetings spoken in over 50 languages, and diagrams meant to explain, however imperfectly, who we once were. Golden records. Each spacecraft carries one. Phonograph discs made of gold-plated copper, designed to endure the ravages of cosmic radiation, meteorite impacts, and the slow erosion of time itself. Etched into their surfaces are instructions, symbolic pulsar maps indicating our solar system's location relative to 14 pulsars, their precise periods encoded so any advanced civilization capable of decoding them might trace a path back to a small yellow star orbited by rocky worlds, one of them blue, one of them, at least for a while, alive. Carl Sagan, who led the committee that assembled these records, once said humanity was made in this gesture, a gesture toward hope, toward connection, toward the possibility that consciousness, however rare it might be in the universe, need not be entirely alone. And yet the record's true audience may never exist. This, too, is part of the mission's quiet tragedy, its quiet grace. Voyager was not built with any true expectation of contact, not in any near-term sense. It was built as an act of reaching, a kind of cosmic message in a bottle tossed into a sea so vast that even a million years of drifting might never bring it to another shore. And still we built it. Still, we placed inside it not just data, not just diagrams of DNA structure or mathematical constants meant to be universal, but images, ordinary images, a mother nursing her child, a highway at dusk, a woman in a supermarket surrounded by fruit, snapshots of a civilization trying, in its own imperfect way, to say, "We were here, we existed, we tried to understand the universe we found ourselves inside, and this is what our brief moment looked like." There is something unbearably tender about this effort, this insistence on being remembered by something that may never come to exist, something that may never have eyes to see, ears to hear, minds capable of comprehending sound or symbol at all. And yet we sent it anyway. That impulse itself, arguably, tells us more about who we are than anything encoded on the record's grooves. It tells us that even facing indifference, even facing an overwhelming likelihood of eternal silence, some part of us still reaches outward, still hopes, still insists on trying to be known. Meanwhile, Voyager itself continues its slow physical transformation, though transformation may be too strong a word for a process so gradual it might be better described as a kind of quiet endurance. Its instruments, once calibrated with such precision to detect magnetic fields and cosmic rays, continue operating in diminished capacity, power dwindling by roughly 4 watts each year as the plutonium powering its generators slowly decays according to its own unchangeable half-life. Engineers on Earth, many of them not yet born when Voyager launched in 1977, now manage this decline with careful precision, deciding which instruments to power down, which data streams to prioritize, extending the mission's life through decisions made with the same reverence one might offer an aging elder, someone whose voice grows fainter but whose presence still matters, still deserves attention, still deserves care. It is remarkable, really, that we still listen. That across 4 decades, across changes in leadership, changes in technology, changes in the very culture that built this fragile machine, we have not stopped listening to what it has to say. Somewhere in California, in a quiet room filled with humming machinery, technicians still tune their receivers toward this faint whisper crossing unimaginable distance, waiting patiently for each new packet of information, each proof that Voyager still exists, still moves, still remembers. In whatever mechanical sense memory applies to circuitry and metal, the mission it was built to carry outward, indifferent to how small or vast the distance still ahead of it might be, indifferent to whether anyone remains, decades or centuries from now, still willing to listen. Consider, too, the strange loneliness of the instruments themselves, tools built with such exquisite care, calibrated by human hands that understood magnetism, plasma, cosmic ray particles, tools meant to reach out and touch the invisible textures of space and translate them into something we could understand. The magnetometer, extended on its long boom away from the spacecraft's body to avoid interference from Voyager's own electronics, still measures the faint magnetic field of interstellar space, a field so weak it defies easy comparison, a few millionths of the strength of Earth's own magnetic field, and yet detectable, meaningful, a signature of the galaxy's larger structure imprinted on empty space itself. This is one of the more startling discoveries Voyager delivered after crossing the heliopause. Interstellar space is not truly empty in the way we once imagined, not truly still. It carries its own magnetic architecture, faint traces of the galaxy's ancient history, remnants of stellar winds and supernova shocks accumulated over millions of years, layered like sediment in a riverbed none of us will ever see with our own eyes. Voyager's plasma wave instrument, too, continues its faint work, listening for the subtle oscillations of charged particles drifting through the interstellar medium, and it was this instrument that offered scientists on Earth their clearest confirmation of Voyager 1's crossing into interstellar space, detecting the increased density of plasma outside the heliosphere compared to the thinner, hotter plasma within the solar wind's bubble. It is a strange kind of hearing, translating electromagnetic oscillations into something like sound, a low and eerie hum that scientists have made audible in recordings shared with the public, an actual voice of interstellar space, alien and haunting, unlike anything born on Earth, unlike wind, unlike ocean waves, unlike any sound shaped by atmosphere or gravity as we know it. Listening to it, even briefly, offers something like vertigo, a reminder of just how different the medium Voyager now traverses truly is, how far removed from anything resembling home. And Earth, meanwhile, continues its own quiet transformations, entirely unaware, in any conscious sense, of the small emissary drifting further from it with each passing moment. Glaciers advance and retreat by fractions of inches, tectonic plates shift by mere centimeters each year, oceans rise almost imperceptibly, human civilizations build and dissolve, wars begin and end, technologies emerge and become obsolete, entire generations are born, grow old, and pass on, and still Voyager drifts onward, indifferent to all of it, carrying within its golden record a snapshot of a world already changed beyond recognition by the time anyone or anything might listen to what it holds. There is something almost sacred in this asymmetry, this quiet mismatch between the frozen moment Voyager carries and the ceaselessly evolving world it left behind. The whale songs recorded onto its golden disk were captured from populations that have since changed their migratory patterns, their vocalizations shifting subtly across generations, meaning the very sounds Voyager carries into eternity are already, in some sense, extinct, a preserved echo of creatures that continue to exist but no longer sing in quite the same way. The greetings spoken in ancient and modern languages alike include tongues that have shifted, evolved, some nearly vanished from daily human use, preserved now more purely on this drifting spacecraft than anywhere on the planet that birthed them. Voyager, in this sense, becomes an accidental archive, a time capsule not just of technology or scientific ambition but of impermanence itself, a physical embodiment of a single frozen instant plucked from an ever-flowing river of change. It invites a kind of meditation on memory, on preservation, on what it means to try to hold onto something in a universe defined by relentless transformation. We build monuments, write books, record voices, take photographs, all efforts to hold time still, if only briefly, if only within the fragile confines of memory or material. Voyager represents perhaps the most ambitious of these efforts, a monument not meant for those who built it, not meant to be visited or touched again by human hands, but launched instead into a future so distant it exists beyond the reach of any living memory, any spoken language, any recognizable descendant of humanity as we understand it today. And so it continues, this slow procession into deeper dark, carrying its quiet cargo of frozen moments, faithful still to instruments built decades ago, faithful to a mission whose original purpose, the exploration of Jupiter and Saturn, has long since been fulfilled and surpassed, transformed instead into something closer to a philosophical experiment stretched across cosmic time. A question posed not to any immediate audience but to whatever future, however distant, however unlikely, might one day find itself capable of asking the same questions we once asked, staring upward into a night sky, wondering whether anything else out there wonders back. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over mission control during the long stretches between Voyager's transmissions, a silence filled not with absence but with anticipation, the quiet hum of servers, the soft glow of monitors displaying numbers that represent, in their own abstract way, a living connection stretched across billions of miles. Engineers speak of Voyager the way one might speak of a distant relative, someone loved but rarely seen, someone whose voice, when it finally arrives, carries the weight of everything unspoken in between. Suzanne Dodd, the mission's project manager, has described the peculiar tenderness of working with a spacecraft whose commands must be written in an aging programming language few engineers still remember, whose systems predate the very existence of the Internet as we now understand it, a machine essentially frozen in the technological assumptions of the 1970s, patched and coaxed forward through decades of ingenuity, workarounds layered upon workarounds, held together as much by human devotion as by circuitry and solder. This devotion matters more than it might first appear. Voyager's continued function depends not simply on hardware but on institutional memory, on aging manuals, on the willingness of engineers to study systems built before most of them were born, learning a kind of digital archaeology in order to keep the mission alive. When a glitch emerged in 2022, causing Voyager 1 to send back garbled telemetry data, seemingly nonsensical readings that suggested some deep confusion within its attitude articulation and control system, teams on Earth spent months tracing the fault, eventually discovering the issue lay not in the computer responsible for the glitch but in another onboard system that had, through some slow failure, begun sending information through an outdated and used computer, one that had not functioned properly in years, scrambling the data in transit. It was a problem requiring not brute computational power but patient, careful reasoning, the kind of diagnostic detective work suited to a mission where every test command takes nearly 2 days to send and confirm, a rhythm of inquiry stretched so slow it demands a kind of monastic patience from those still tending this distant flame. And still, they solved it. Still, Voyager speaks clearly again, at least for now, its signals resuming their proper form, its distant heartbeat steady once more. There is something quietly moving in this persistence, in the fact that even as the spacecraft drifts further from any hope of physical repair, human ingenuity continues finding ways to extend its voice, to coax a few more years, a few more months, sometimes just a few more days of communication from a machine that by any reasonable expectation should have fallen silent decades ago. It was designed for a 5-year mission to Jupiter and Saturn. It has now operated for nearly 50 years, a testament not just to its own hardened engineering, but to the persistent, almost stubborn devotion of the humans who have refused to let it go quiet before its time. Perhaps this, too, deserves reflection, the peculiar human impulse to extend, to preserve, to resist the natural entropy that governs all things, even when the odds of ultimate success remain vanishingly small. We know with near certainty that one day, whether in the early 2030s or perhaps slightly beyond, Voyager's power will finally dip below the threshold required to keep its transmitter alive, and its voice, already faint, already traveling across nearly a full day of light-speed delay, will simply stop. No dramatic ending will mark this moment, no final message, no closing statement. Simply an absence where once there was a whisper, a silence added to the greater silence of space, indistinguishable from everything around it. And yet, even in this eventual quiet, Voyager will not cease to exist. It will not become debris in any meaningful sense, will not decay or disintegrate as objects do within an atmosphere. It will simply continue, propelled by momentum granted decades ago, drifting further from the star that once warmed the small blue world of its origin, carrying its golden record, its silicon chips, its structural aluminum frame, functionally eternal in the vacuum of interstellar space, a monument without a caretaker, a voice without a mouth, a question without, perhaps, ever receiving an answer. There is a strange peace to be found in this eventual outcome, an odd comfort in imagining Voyager continuing long after every voice that once spoke to it has fallen silent in turn. It becomes, in its silence, something like a promise kept, a message delivered even without confirmation of receipt, a gesture completed regardless of whether anyone, or anything, ever witnesses its arrival. Sagan once wrote that the launching of this vessel was significant not because of contact, but because of the attempt, the reaching outward, regardless of what waits in the dark to receive it. And there is something in that thought worth carrying into the quiet hours of the mind, something worth letting settle like sediment at the bottom of a still lake. The value was never contingent on an answer. The value lived in the act itself, in the audacity of building a small machine and asking it to speak on behalf of an entire species, across a distance so vast that speech itself becomes almost meaningless, becomes something closer to prayer. Consider, for a moment, the strangeness of that golden record, still bolted to Voyager's frame, still waiting in the cold dark for a stylus that may never arrive. 90 minutes of music. Greetings in dozens of languages. The sound of a mother's kiss, a baby's first cry, a heartbeat, thunder, wind moving through trees that no longer stand in the same forests, whales calling to other whales in oceans that have shifted their currents in the decades since the recording was made. All of it pressed into copper, gold-plated, sealed against the erosion of time in a way that nothing on Earth's surface could ever be sealed. No rain will fall on it. No wind will wear it down. No bacteria will consume it. No fungus will bloom across its surface. No rust will creep along its edges, because rust requires oxygen, and out there, past the heliopause, there is no oxygen to be found. There is only the record, patient, unblinking, a small golden eye turned toward a future it will never perceive. It is worth pausing here, in this drifting quiet, to think about what patience actually means when applied to an object. A human being who waits is aware, in some sense, of the waiting. There is a felt duration, a weight to the hours, a mind counting or refusing to count. Voyager has no such awareness. It does not experience the passage of centuries as slow or fast. It does not feel the ache of anticipation. And yet the word patience still seems to fit the shape of what is happening, because patience, at its root, may simply mean continuing to exist in the direction of a hope, whether or not that hope is felt by the one who carries it. Perhaps this is the quiet lesson tucked inside Voyager's long silence. That meaning does not require consciousness to sustain it. That an object built with intention can carry that intention forward long after the intention itself has been forgotten by everyone who once held it. The engineers who wired its circuits are gone now, or nearly all of them. The scientists who selected the sounds for the golden record have, one by one, joined the same silence they once tried to speak into. Carl Sagan himself has been gone since 1996, 3 decades of Earth years unfolding without him, and yet the spacecraft he helped envision continues to move, continues to carry his hope outward, indifferent to his absence, indifferent to time itself. Right now, as these words are spoken into a quiet room somewhere on Earth, Voyager 1 is more than 15 billion miles from the Sun, further than any human-made object has ever traveled, moving through the space between the stars at nearly 38,000 miles an hour. Its radio signal, faint as a whisper spread across a continent, takes over 23 hours to reach the antennas waiting for it in California and Madrid and Canberra. 23 hours for light itself, the fastest thing in the universe, to cross the distance that separates us. And still, Voyager sends what little it can. A hum of instrument readings. A thread of telemetry, thinner now than it once was, as one by one its instruments are switched off to conserve the dwindling trickle of power still generated by the slow radioactive decay inside its plutonium heart. There is something almost unbearably tender in this image, if you allow yourself to sit with it. A machine, alone in the true dark between stars, doling out its own dying warmth in careful rations, deciding, or having decided for it, long ago, by hands that no longer exist, which small part of itself to let go quiet next, so that some other part might speak a little longer. The camera, silenced years ago. The plasma instrument, dimmed. Each shut down a small, deliberate mercy, buying months, sometimes years, of continued whisper from whatever remains. It is not so different, perhaps, from the way a body in its final season begins to withdraw warmth from its extremities to protect the heart, the brain, the essential core of itself. Voyager, too, is learning to die slowly, thoughtfully, on a timeline stretched so long that the word dying almost loses its urgency, softens into something more like a settling, a long exhale spread across half a century. And somewhere in the middle of that exhale, still, it listens. Still, if Earth were to speak to it, it would hear. That capacity for reception is one of the last things engineers expect to fail, long after the instruments have gone dark, long after the golden record has stopped mattering to anyone still living to remember why it was made. The listening may be the last thing to go. And so, tonight, and every night after, somewhere in the folded hills of California, a dish 70 meters wide tilts its face toward a point in the sky where Voyager is not, but where Voyager was, some 23 hours ago, patient as stone, listening for a whisper it may or may not receive. There is something almost devotional in this act, repeated night after night, year after year, by people who will mostly go unnamed in the history of what they tended. Think of the engineers at the Deep Space Network, adjusting antennas by fractions of a degree, compensating for the slow wobble of the Earth's rotation, the almost imperceptible drift of a spacecraft that has not changed course in decades because there is nothing left to change it. They are not unlike the keepers of old lighthouses, the ones who once climbed spiral stairs each evening to light a flame for ships that might never pass, might never need it, might already have wrecked on some other shore entirely. And still the flame was lit. Still the watch was kept. There is a kind of faith embedded in maintenance, in showing up for a task whose completion you may never witness, whose necessity you cannot fully verify, simply because the alternative, letting the flame go dark, feels like a small betrayal of something larger than yourself. Consider the strange loneliness carried not just by Voyager, but by the people on this end of the silence, the ones who built their careers, in some cases their entire working lives, around a single spacecraft's slow crawl into the dark. Ed Stone, who served as chief scientist for the Voyager mission for nearly 50 years, longer than many marriages, longer than most careers in any field, watched as the spacecraft he helped launch outlived the instruments meant to study it, outlived colleagues, outlived, eventually, himself, when he stepped back from the role in 2022 and passed away in 2024. The mission he shepherded still humming faintly onward without him, the way a river continues past the point where a particular stone first entered its current. There is no cruelty in this. Rivers do not mean to leave stones behind. They simply continue, as rivers do, as Voyager does, indifferent not out of malice but out of the sheer physics of momentum, the simple fact that once a thing is moving fast enough, in a vacuum, nothing further is required of it to keep moving. No engine hums to sustain its flight now. No thrust is needed to overcome friction, because there is no friction here, no air to resist against, no gravity strong enough at this distance to meaningfully curve its path. It simply goes, the way a thought goes once spoken aloud, the way a choice, once made, continues to shape everything after it, whether or not the one who made it remains to witness the shaping. Try, for a moment, to hold the scale of this in your mind, though the mind was never quite built for distances like these. 15 billion miles is not a number that fits comfortably into human intuition. We can picture a mile. We can walk one, feel its length in our legs and lungs. We can perhaps picture 100 miles, the distance between two familiar cities, a long drive taken once or twice a year. But 15 billion miles resists comprehension the way staring directly into a bright light resists the eye, the way certain truths resist being held too closely without looking away. And yet Voyager is there, precisely there, at this exact and receding moment, small and cold and dark against the stars, still carrying its cargo of Earth sounds and Earth images, still carrying the shape of a hand once photographed in negative and etched into gold, still carrying mathematical diagrams meant to explain, to any intelligence capable of parsing them, where this small blue and green and white world once orbited, and roughly when, in the impossibly long span of cosmic time, this particular voice was sent outward. It is strange to think that Voyager may, in some sense, outlive not just its makers but the very species that made it. Should humanity vanish tomorrow, through some folly or accident or simple entropy, Voyager would not know. It would not pause in its flight. It would not mourn. It would simply continue, carrying a message from a civilization that might, by the time any recipient found it, no longer exist to confirm the message's accuracy. In this way, Voyager becomes something closer to a fossil than a transmission, an artifact of a moment already past by the time it might be found, the way starlight itself is always old light, always a message from a version of a star that may have already changed, or dimmed, or died entirely, by the time its glow reaches an eye somewhere in the dark, still reading it as though it were new, still reading it as though the star that made it were still burning, unaware that in some cases some stars have already gone quiet. There is a peculiar comfort, if you allow yourself to feel it, in knowing that Voyager's light, so to speak, will also arrive late to whoever might someday receive it. That whatever eyes, if any eyes exist to receive such things, encounter the golden record millennia from now, they will not be looking at humanity as it is, or was, in any immediate sense. They will be looking at a kind of echo, a preserved moment plucked from 1977 and flung forward across a gulf of time so vast that the civilization which made the recording may have already transformed beyond recognition, or vanished, or grown into something that would no longer recognize its own reflection in that small gold disk. This is not a tragedy. It is simply the nature of messages sent across distances too large for real-time conversation. Every letter written to a future reader carries this same quality, the same gentle mismatch between the moment of writing and the moment of reading, but Voyager stretches that mismatch to a scale that borders on the geological, the astronomical, the nearly incomprehensible. Consider that Voyager 1 will not pass anywhere near another star for tens of thousands of years. In about 40,000 years, give or take, it will drift within roughly 1.5 light-years of a star called Gliese 445, a small red dwarf in the constellation Camelopardalis, though drift is perhaps too gentle a word for a pass that will not resemble anything like a visit. 1.5 light-years is still an immense gulf, still 9 trillion miles of nothing, still far too distant for Voyager to be pulled into any orbit, far too distant for it to be noticed by anything that might live near that star, should anything live there at all. It will simply pass, the way a single grain of sand might drift past a distant shoreline without ever touching it, without ever being counted among the grains that belong to that shore. And then it will continue on, into the deeper dark beyond, toward no destination in particular, because interstellar space does not offer destinations in the way we imagine them. There is no port at the far end of this journey. There is only more space, more dark, more quiet, stretching outward in every direction toward stars so distant their light left them before human civilization existed at all. Try to imagine the kind of patience this implies, if patience is still the right word for a machine incapable of waiting in any felt sense. 40,000 years is roughly 8 times the length of all recorded human history. It is a span so long that the very language spoken by the people who built Voyager, English as it existed in the 20th century, will have drifted into something unrecognizable, the way Old English now reads as a foreign tongue to modern eyes, The way the language on the Golden Record's greetings may itself become a kind of fossil script, decipherable only through careful reconstruction, if humanity even persists long enough to attempt such reconstruction. And Voyager will not care, will not know, will not mark the passing of these 40,000 years in any way beyond the slow and steady ticking forward of its own trajectory, indifferent to every empire that will rise and fall on the small world it left behind, indifferent to every language that will be born and buried, every war forgotten, every name erased from memory in the long unfolding of that span. There is something almost unbearably vast in this thought, and yet also something quietly soothing, the way certain enormities become, paradoxically, restful once fully absorbed. Because if Voyager can continue, indifferent and untouched, through 40,000 years of cosmic silence, then perhaps there is a kind of permission embedded in that fact, a permission to release, if only briefly, the smaller anxieties that tend to crowd a single human night. The traffic tomorrow. The unanswered message. The long list of small unfinished tasks that seem, in the quiet hours before sleep, to matter so terribly much. Against the backdrop of Voyager's journey, these things do not disappear, do not become meaningless exactly, but they do shrink, gently, into a more bearable proportion, the way a stone held close to the eye can block out an entire mountain, until it is set back down at the correct distance, and the mountain returns to view, and the stone becomes, once more, only a stone. Perhaps this is part of why Voyager continues to call to something in us, decades after its launch, long after its cameras went dark, long after its instruments began, one by one, to fall silent. It offers a strange, cold comfort, a reminder that continuation does not require witness, that a thing can remain in motion, can remain intact, can remain, in some sense, faithful to its original purpose, without anyone left to confirm that faithfulness. It asks nothing of the dark it moves through. It expects nothing of the stars it will never reach. It simply continues, the way certain quiet efforts continue long after the reasons for beginning them have been forgotten, carried forward by nothing more than the momentum of an old and steady intention, set in motion long ago by hands that understood, even then, that they were building something meant to outlast them entirely. There is a particular kind of humility in that act, the humility of engineers and scientists who spent years of their working lives calibrating instruments, writing code into memory banks smaller than a modern kitchen appliance, knowing full well that the machine they built would likely continue long after their own names had faded from public memory, long after the mission itself had been quietly folded into textbooks and archives, a footnote in the long story of a species that once looked up and wondered what lay beyond the edge of its own small neighborhood. It is worth pausing here to consider what Voyager actually carries now, in these later years of its journey, stripped down as it is to only the barest of functions. Its cameras were switched off decades ago, shortly after they had captured what they were built to capture, the last photographs of the outer planets, including that final look backward toward Earth, a pale blue dot suspended in a single sunbeam, a photograph Sagan himself requested against the initial reluctance of mission planners, who worried the image would offer little scientific value. And in some strict sense, they were right. The photograph revealed no new data about Earth's composition, no fresh insight into its atmosphere or geology. Its value was never scientific in that narrow sense. Its value was existential, was philosophical, was the simple, staggering fact of seeing home reduced to less than a single pixel, suspended in a scattering of light, utterly indistinguishable from the vast emptiness surrounding it, except for the knowledge that everything ever known, every love, every war, every quiet Tuesday afternoon, had happened there, on that mote of dust, caught in a beam of accidental light. That photograph, more than perhaps any single image in the history of spaceflight, seemed to distill something true about the nature of perspective, about the strange vertigo that comes from truly grasping one's own smallness. And yet Voyager did not linger on that photograph. It did not pause to consider what it had done. It simply continued its work, continued gathering what data it could of the magnetic fields and cosmic rays and solar wind particles that make up the invisible textures of space, continued sending its findings home in a signal that grew fainter and fainter as the distance stretched further, until the photographs stopped, and then, one by one, other instruments followed, switched off deliberately, thoughtfully, to conserve what remained of its dwindling power, until what remains today is closer to a whisper than a voice, a scientist's slow accounting of magnetic field strength and particle density, sent home not as poetry but as raw and unadorned fact, the kind of fact that requires no translation, no metaphor, no human framing to hold its meaning. And yet, even stripped of nearly everything, even reduced to little more than a heartbeat sent home across the dark, Voyager still manages to feel, to those who study its data, something like a companion, something like an old friend whose conversation has grown sparse but who is still, undeniably, present, still there, still listening, still willing to answer when called upon, even if the answer takes nearly a full day to arrive. There is something almost sacred in that continued attentiveness, in the fact that after nearly 50 years, after outliving so many of its original engineers, after drifting so far past the boundaries of what its builders imagined it might survive to see, it still turns its antenna toward home when asked, still speaks, in its faint and dwindling voice, into a receiver waiting patiently across the impossible dark. There will come a day, likely within the next few years, when even this last conversation ends. When the plutonium at its heart has decayed past the threshold needed to power even its most essential systems, when the final instrument switches to standby and does not switch back on, when the last signal crosses those billions of miles and reaches an antenna in California or Australia or Spain, and is received, and understood, and logged, and there is nothing more to log after that. It will not be a dramatic death. There will be no explosion, no final burst of static, no dramatic countdown. It will simply be a silence that follows a signal, a silence indistinguishable, at first, from any of the ordinary silences between transmissions, until enough time passes, enough hours, enough days, enough attempts to re-establish contact, that the silence begins to take on a different quality, begins to feel less like a pause and more like an ending. And even then, Voyager will not know this has happened. It will not mark the moment of its own last useful breath. It will simply continue on, unaware of its own silence, unaware that the last voice it once carried home has finally gone quiet, unaware that somewhere behind it, on a small world it left so long ago, people will notice, will feel the particular weight of that ending, will perhaps pause for a moment in their own lives to mark the passing of a machine that was never alive in any sense we usually mean, and yet somehow earned, across 5 decades of faithful transmission, something that felt very much like a life. There is no need to mourn this ending as tragedy. It is, instead, something closer to completion, the natural closing of a long and extraordinary arc that began on a launch pad in Florida in the late summer of 1977, when a nation still uncertain of its place in the wider cosmos decided, nonetheless, to send a small emissary outward, carrying with it not just instruments but hope, not just data but a kind of quiet, defiant optimism about what human beings might mean to whatever else exists in this unimaginably large universe. Voyager was never meant to answer every question it raised. It was never meant to make contact, not truly, not in any way that could be measured or confirmed within a human lifetime or 100 human lifetimes. It was meant, instead, to try, to reach, to place a single careful gesture into the dark and trust that the reaching itself held value, regardless of what silence answered back. And so when its voice finally does go quiet, whenever that day arrives, it will not mean the end of Voyager's journey. It will only mean the end of the conversation. The spacecraft itself will continue precisely as it has continued, drifting outward at the same steady speed, carrying the same golden record, the same etched diagrams, the same hydrogen atom drawn in careful lines meant to explain, to anyone capable of understanding it, the basic unit of time and space from which all other units might be derived. It will continue past Gliese 445 in 40,000 years, indifferent to whatever has become of Earth by then, indifferent to whether humanity still exists to remember having sent it, indifferent to whether any ears anywhere in the galaxy will ever hear the sounds recorded on that golden disk, the greetings, the music, the laughter, the single recorded heartbeat meant to stand in for every heartbeat that ever quickened in fear or love or wonder on that small blue world. Perhaps that is the final thought worth carrying from all of this, into whatever rest now waits on the other side of this long, slow story. That some gestures are complete in themselves, regardless of whether they are received. That meaning does not require an audience to be real. That a message can be worth sending even into silence, even across a distance so vast it borders on the eternal, simply because the sending itself, the reaching itself, says something true about the ones who sent it. Voyager will likely drift for billions of years, long after the sun that once warmed its makers has swollen and dimmed and finally gone dark itself, long after Earth has been swallowed, perhaps, by that same dying star, long after every trace of human civilization has been erased from the geological record of the world that made it. And still, somewhere out there, a small golden disk will continue turning slowly in the dark, carrying a whale's call, a child's laughter, a mathematical proof, a photograph of a hand, patient, unweathered, untouched by the erosion that claims nearly everything else in the universe, waiting for a moment that may never come, and finding, in some strange way, that the waiting was never really the point. The point was always the sending. The reaching outward, against the overwhelming odds of the silence, against the near certainty of never knowing whether the message was received. It was an act of faith performed by a species capable of imagining minds unlike its own, capable of caring, even briefly, even faintly, about beings it will never meet, in places it will never see, across time spans it can barely comprehend. That, perhaps, is Voyager's true legacy, more than the science it gathered, more than the images it captured, more than even the golden record it carries. It is the simple, enduring proof that reaching outward, into the dark, toward the unknown, without guarantee of answer, without certainty of audience, was still, somehow, worth doing. And on that thought, drifting now alongside Voyager itself, this long journey comes, gently, to its rest.